and I was suspended in midair.
If you read the Post story, you might conclude that she was in favor of violence in Palestine and that she supported the girls who were walking around with those T-shirts, and therefore she was in favor of violence.
So I immediately rushed to my office, emailed the press secretary. I did not defend the T-shirts. My words were taken out of context, and all of my words were not used in the piece. I never gave any impression that I condone violence. And I never minimized the historical context. I gave that historical context.
Reporters are in the business of reporting news and making news. And this reporter thought that he had a story here, and he did. Clearly, she didn't need to answer it. She could have said, I didn't put out this T-shirt, no comment. So her first mistake was talking about it.
What do you think New York Intifada means, remove oppression? It means violent assault on Jews. That's what it means. Yasser Arafat was a terrorist. The Intifada was a terrorist operation to kill women and children. That's what it was about. Yeah.
There's an unfortunate effect in the Jewish community, that's the community I know best, of a tendency to circle the wagons and to declare certain topics, at least for public discussion, out of bounds.
If your family were all burnt in ovens, if you were the sole survivor of your family...
My grandparents are survivors.
Really?
Tone down your offensive rhetoric.
And they produced an asshole like you.
Fine.
And they produced an asshole like you.
You're righteous.
Can you imagine?
You are solely righteous. I give it to you.
You're a Nazi socialist.
I was called to see whether or not she had a claim for libel. And I went through all the papers, and she does not have a claim of libel. So, yes, everything that they said there is protected.
So they can essentially assassinate somebody's character that way, and there's
Right.
no real legal repercussion.
Right,
No legal remedy.
right.
And is that okay?
Under the law, it's okay.
New Visions said to me, what happened this week in the Post right now has made matters for you extremely bad. There is no recovery. The only way we will go forward is with you stepping down. I want to speak to Chancellor Klein.
There's a whole bunch of people who are trying to portray this as a religious school. It's not. Period. End of discussion.
Get him on the phone, and I want to speak to him. And his response to me was, he's in Colorado on vacation in the mountains, but I was able to get the deputy mayor, Dennis Walcott, to talk to you.
A lot of support to make that dream a reality.
And of course, I started explaining to Dennis what happened, and he said, I'm so glad to hear that you've made the decision and that you are making this sacrifice. I am in the process of finding an assistant principalship for you in one of our schools.
I know the woman. She's worked for the city in a variety of capacities, and I appreciate all her service.
I want your resignation letter by 8 o'clock in the morning. Upon receiving it, we're going to be preparing the mayor to announce your resignation on his radio show at 10 a.m. There is nothing else left to discuss.
Principal resigned today.
Did she?
Yep. But I think she felt that she had become the focus rather than having the school the focus, and so today she submitted her resignation, which is nice of her to do.
There's the chilling effect. Muslim Americans feel that they have to watch what they say. Does that concern you, or is that just is that a necessary
Look,
price?
everybody has to watch what he says, right? If you're in a situation where there's some threat to the country, and then you have people who are the same ethnicity as the threateners, yes, of course they're going to be careful in what they say because they don't want to be confused with the enemy, right?
She said something a couple days ago. She got a question. She's not all that media savvy, maybe, and she tried to explain a word rather than just condemn.
She's certainly not a terrorist.
The President is hereby empowered to designate as alien enemies any citizens or subjects of hostile nations residing in the United States whose presence he regards as dangerous, and make regulations for their apprehension, restraint, or removal.
There are over 25,000 Frenchmen in Philadelphia alone, Mr. President.
Necessity is the excuse for every infringement on freedom. That's what William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, said back in the 18th century. Governments are always claiming that, especially in times of crisis, that freedom is an inconvenience. Freedom of speech is dangerous.
And in fact, very early, actually before 1800, when the Federalists were in power, they passed Alien and Sedition Acts, which punished political advocacy in a way that would be regarded as completely unconstitutional today.
Cannot protect the nation by attacking the right of every man to speak freely without fear. You're trampling on the Constitution.
The modern notion of free speech is surprisingly modern. The first series of free speech cases were really in the context of the suppression of speech, mostly of socialists, sometimes of anarchists, around the time of World War I.
Thousands of people were rounded up by the government.
And the public seemed glad to have any type of radical brought to trial.
Many aliens deported. These were not people who were putting bombs around or sabotaging the military effort. They were people who were expressing unpopular ideas.
The great socialist and IWW leader, Eugene Victor Debs, jailed in 1918 for sedition, when he opposed U.S. participation in the war.
And in the Schenck case, he was distributing socialistic materials, and again, he was arrested under the Espionage Act. In both cases, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of people for saying unpopular things. Holmes, the Supreme Court justice, used the famous phrase, free speech doesn't mean the right to cry fire in a crowded theater.
Fire!
In other words, that speech then will lead to disastrous action.
Back in the 1920s, in the Schenck case, the Supreme Court for the first time was looking thoroughly at the whole question of what kind of speech can be limited.
The free speech we enjoy today is the result of many struggles in our past by groups that have been denied freedom of speech.
So, Dad, you wrote in your book, growing up, I feared my freedom was a fragile thing, and I felt, as my father did, that Jews should keep low profiles and not speak out at all. Can you talk to us a little bit about that right now?
Okay, sure. My father and mother were immigrants from Poland. They came over in the mid-20s. By the time I was born, they had a candy store in Brooklyn. We lived above the candy store in Brooklyn. And when I was 3 years old, there was a fire upstairs, and my mother died. She burned. I don't know what the kind of person my father was before that happened. I was too small, but apparently was crushed by it and never got over it for the rest of his life. My father and his family had lived through pogroms in Poland. He had 10 brothers and sisters. One had come over, the rest had died in the Holocaust. He was constantly afraid that something would happen in this country. Back in the 1940s, there was a substantial pro-German movement that tried to keep us out of war with Germany. When I was a kid, I knew about the Bund, and I knew about things they were doing. And I knew about rallies in Madison Square Garden and other places where swastikas were hung up.
This was Madison Square Garden in New York City, and not Berlin nor Nuremberg.
So he always felt that there would be a recurrence of that. But he made it very clear to me that the way to survive was to keep your head down, don't let anybody know what you're doing, and never speak up. He had no vision of what else he could do. So he was really locked in the candy store. I saw the price that my father paid for not speaking up. He became defenseless, and yet through him, I learned something about the First Amendment.
Why is freedom of speech so essential to a free society? Perhaps Daniel Webster put it best when he remarked that if he were deprived of all his rights save one, he would preserve the freedom to speak. For by proclaiming it, he could regain all the others which he had lost.
The way our Constitution is written and the way this democracy is supposed to work, everybody has a right to have their voice heard.
If you're going to defend free speech, you have to defend the speech of people who you hate.
Nazis from Chicago have been wanting to march through Skokie, Illinois for several years. But more than half of the people who live in Skokie are Jewish, and they have resisted.
And the Nazis were going to march in the streets of Skokie because they knew it would draw a great deal of attention, and they knew that the Jews of Skokie would be very, very upset about it. And the town of Skokie got an injunction against the Nazis marching there.
If necessary, take the lead in a fight to see that Nazism never raises its head again.
There was a great deal of infighting at the ACLU as to whether or not the ACLU should take the case. The ACLU has a substantial Jewish constituency, and I think it's fair to say that a large percentage of the Jewish constituency thought it was the wrong case to take. I felt that the ACLU should take the case. What I did basically, the case was handled by the Roger Baldwin Foundation. I had previously been the head of that foundation. I was clearly interested in the issues, and I went around the country talking about the Skokie case. I spoke at synagogues, I spoke at schools, in an attempt to talk about the issues in the way that I spoke about them now. And I have never spoken about issues that drew so much hostility. People saying, because of you, people wind up in ovens, crematoriums, all kinds of inconceivable threats. We used to get calls at 2 in the morning, and it was just a horrendous experience.
It's amazing how many people in this country think they should kill people who don't agree with them. It's amazing, you know, really. And these are people who claim they're defending liberty.
Death to the Nazis! Power, power, power to the workers!
In this situation, I can understand how the Jews of Skokie would be upset. When I told my father about the case, told him what I was doing, he was horrified.
The moral principle is that the Constitution has been upheld, and that freedom is not just a nebulous concept on paper, but freedom, in fact, exists for those who are willing to fight for it.
Did you ever feel like you were being used to an end that was hateful to you?
I'm being used to an end that's hateful to me, but I'm also being used to an end that's important to me.
Nothing's riding on this except the First Amendment of the Constitution, freedom of the press, and maybe the future of the country.
The question is, can you say that homosexuality is wrong in a public school?
Protesters say they're speaking out against discrimination by not speaking at all.
It was a school-wide event, the Day of Silence, and the point of that day was to say that sexual freedom is great. And obviously, that's what the school was putting forth, because there was no, Day of Marriage or something like that at all, ever.